Night fell over the small town of Crestwood, bringing with it an air of mystery and unrest. Detective Jameson looked out the station office window, watching the light rain falling outside. It was one of those nights that portended trouble, and he wasn't wrong. The call came in around 10 p.m. It was a disappearance. A 22-year-old girl named Emily had mysteriously disappeared. There were no witnesses, no suspects, just a young woman who went for a walk and never came back. Jameson grabbed his coat and headed to the police car. His partner, Detective Reynolds, was already waiting. They knew that every minute counted in a missing persons case. Emily's last cell phone signal located her in a remote area of the woods on the outskirts of Crestwood. It was vague information, but it was all they had. As they drove down the dark, winding road that led into the forest, Jameson thought about all the horror stories he had heard about the place as a child. Whispers, dancing shadows, and strange, unexplained phenomena. Reynolds didn't say anything, but Jameson knew he was nervous too. They had faced many difficult cases over the years, but something about this one made them uneasy. The gravel road ended in a narrow trail, and the detectives had to continue on foot. The rain had turned the path into mud, making progress difficult. Jameson and Reynolds used their flashlights to light the way as the wind howled through the trees. Finally, they reached a clearing where they saw an abandoned car. It was the same car as Emily. There was no sign of her, but there was something disturbing. The car was covered in scratched marks and cryptic messages written with a finger on the fogged window. Reynolds frowned, shining his flashlight at the messages. This is unsettling. They are watching "Don't Trust, Turn Around." What the hell happened here? Jameson looked at the messages and felt a chill run down his spine. This is more than a bad joke. Someone is trying to scare us. They decided to follow the trail that extended from the abandoned car, guided only by the dim light of the flashlight. The forest seemed alive with murmurs and whispers, but there was no sign of Emily. As they advanced, the detectives began to feel that they were being watched. The feeling that something was wrong deepened as they found disturbing traces. Clothes torn and stained with blood, small dolls hanging from trees, and pieces of paper with terrifying messages. Reynolds looked nervous, his eyes scanning the surrounding darkness. "I don't know, Jameson, but I think we're dealing with something much more sinister than a simple disappearance." Jameson nodded, keeping the flashlight moving as they examined the remains. "We have to find Emily and get out of this place as quickly as possible." As they continued forward, the detectives heard distant, unsettling laughter. They seemed to echo around them, impossible to locate. The forest seemed to conspire against them, creating eerie shadows and murmurs that left them feeling like they weren't alone. The detectives continued to follow the trail, guided only by the dim light of their flashlights and the disturbing markings they found along the way. Each step took them deeper into the shadowy forest, where darkness and rain seemed to conspire to hide sinister secrets. As they advanced, the murmurs and whispers that echoed around them became clearer. They sounded like distorted laughter and whispering voices, but they couldn't identify the source of these disturbing sounds. Suddenly, Reynolds stopped and pointed his flashlight at the ground. He had found something that made the hairs on the back of both their necks stand up. They were dolls, small and broken, hanging from tree branches like macabre decorations. The dolls had disheveled hair and disfigured faces, and some were stained with what looked like dried blood. "This is sick," murmured Jameson, examining the dolls with a sense of growing uneasiness. Nobody would do something like that without a reason. They continued to follow the trail and soon found pieces of paper scattered across the ground. The messages written on them were terrifying. "They are close, there's no escape. You will be next." The words seemed to echo in the silence of the forest. "This is a trap," Reynolds whispered, his hand going to his gun. "Someone is playing with us, Jameson." Jameson nodded, his jaw clenched. They were dealing with something they couldn't fully understand, something that challenged them at every turn. Finally, the trail led them to a small cabin in the middle of the forest. It looked abandoned, but the windows were dirty and fogged up, making it impossible to see what was inside. The door was ajar. Cautiously, the detectives pushed open the door and entered the cabin. The air was damp and smelled musty, as if no one had been in there in years. The ground creaked beneath their feet, and the darkness inside the cabin was almost palpable. The walls of the cabin were covered with photographs of Emily. Some were photos taken while she was walking down the street, others while she was at home, sleeping. It was as if someone had been following her, watching every move she made. "This is sick," Jameson whispered, his voice full of disgust. "Who would do something like that?" Reynolds looked around, his flashlight illuminating the photographs. "And someone was here recently. The candle over there is lit, and it's still dripping with melted wax." They continued to search the cabin and found a dark basement. With the flashlight in hand, they went down the stairs, hoping to find some clue that would lead them to Emily. The basement was cold and damp, full of stacked boxes and dusty furniture. But in the far corner, there was a solid steel door. There was no handle, just an old lock. "It must be here," Jameson whispered, terrified of what they might find on the other side of that door. The detectives looked at the steel door with a sense of apprehension. It was clear that the basement hid some dark secret, and the disturbing messages and chilling traces found so far had them prepared for anything. With determination, Jameson picked up a piece of wood he found in the basement and used it to try to open the steel door. With a metallic creak, the door opened, revealing an even more sinister interior. The basement was lit only by the dim light of the detectives' flashlights, which created deep, unsettling shadows on the damp walls. Emily was there, bound and gagged, her eyes filled with fear. Her lips moved as if she was trying to say something, but the gag prevented her from speaking. Jameson and Reynolds rushed to free her, their hands shaking with anxiety. As they did so, they heard dark, distorted laughter all around them. The basement walls seemed to move as if they were alive. And then, sinister figures emerged from the shadows. They were deformed people, wearing horrifying masks that hid their faces. "You shouldn't have come here," said one of the figures in a distorted and inhuman voice. Reynolds drew his gun, pointing it at the figures, but before he could fire, they lunged at them. A frantic fight ensued, with the detectives fighting for Emily's life. The figures' masks fell off, revealing distorted and grotesque faces that seemed like something out of a nightmare. Emily, finally freed, picked up a knife from the floor and fought alongside the detectives. The fight seemed to last forever, with the detectives doing their best to fend off the figures and make sure Emily was safe. The figures seemed determined to protect the secret they hid in that basement. But finally, the detectives and Emily managed to drive them away, leaving them behind as they fled the macabre basement. The rain continued to fall outside, and they ran through the dark forest, with the shadowy figures chasing them tirelessly. The forest seemed to conspire against them, creating barriers and shadows that made their escape even more terrifying. The rain drenched them as they struggled to find their way back. They were completely lost in that dark forest, where tall, dense trees blocked the light of the moon and stars. Finally, they reached the road where they had left the police car. They got into the vehicle and accelerated. As they walked away, Emily explained that she had come to the cabin of her own free will, drawn by cryptic messages she had received. She thought she was investigating a case, but soon realized it was just bait to lure more victims into the nightmare forest. The story of what happened that night became a case of unbelievable horror for detectives Jameson and Reynolds. The shadowy figures and ominous forest have become urban legends, leaving indelible scars on minds. The police car cut along the dark road, moving away from the macabre forest and the sinister figures that inhabited its depth. The engine roared as Jameson, Reynolds, and Emily put the nightmare they had faced behind them. The rain continued to fall outside, as if nature itself was crying for the horrors they had witnessed. Everyone in the car was drenched, but a sense of relief flooded their minds. As they drove back to the city, silence prevailed inside the vehicle. Words seemed useless in light of the experience they had shared. They knew that that nightmare would leave deep marks in their memories. It was Emily who finally broke the silence. What were those beings, and what did they want? Jameson sighed, looking at the road ahead. "We don't know, Emily. We don't know anything about them, but I'm sure they weren't ordinary humans." Reynolds agreed, still tense from the fight they had in the basement of the cabin. They were determined to protect whatever was in that basement. They didn't want witnesses. Emily closed her eyes, trying to process what had happened. And the basement. What was that? What were they hiding? None of the detectives had an answer. They only knew that the cellar hid a terrible secret, a secret that was now lost in the forest's dark past. As they approached the city, a sense of relief washed over them. They had escaped the nightmare, and now it was time to make sure Emily was safe. The police station would be his temporary refuge. When they arrived at the police station, the atmosphere seemed less gloomy than in the forest. The lights were on, and other officers were rushing to help when they saw Emily's condition. She was immediately taken to a doctor to check her condition. The detectives reported what happened to the station chief, but he seemed skeptical. This all seems unbelievable, like a horror story. Are you saying that grotesque figures attacked you in the forest? Jameson nodded, his face serious. That's exactly what happened, boss. We don't know who they were or what they wanted, but Emily was in real danger. The chief looked at the detectives and then at Emily, who was still in shock. We'll look into this further, but I need more evidence than scary stories. As the investigation continued, detectives tried to process what they had faced that night. The dark forest and sinister figures would continue to haunt his nightmares for a long time. Time passed, and the case became something of an urban legend in the small town of Crestwood. The forbidden forest and sinister beings were the subjects of frightening stories told in whispers at night. But for Jameson, Reynolds, and Emily, what happened that night was more than a horror story. It was a nightmare they would never forget, an experience that brought them together in an indescribable way. They may never fully understand what they faced in that forest, but they knew the horror was closer than they could imagine, hidden in the shadows and secrets of a dark past.